Picture this. The year is 1456, and somewhere in the stone corridors of a Welsh castle, a 13-year-old girl doubles over in agony. Her small hands grip the cold wall as pain tears through her body like lightning. This isn't just any child. This is Lady Margaret Beaufort, and inside her barely developed frame grows the future of England itself. What happens next will echo through centuries of history, shaping the very foundations of the Tudor dynasty. But here's what most people don't realize about this story. Margaret's pregnancy wasn't just medically dangerous for a girl her age. It was politically explosive. Every noble family in England was watching, waiting, calculating how this child's birth might shift the balance of power forever, because the baby she carried would one day become Henry VII, the king who would end the bloodiest civil war in English history. Before we dive deeper into this incredible tale of survival against impossible odds, I want you to know something. This isn't just another history lesson. This is the story of how a girl barely past childhood became one of the most powerful women who ever lived, and how her sacrifice in that castle chamber would reshape the world. If you're fascinated by the hidden stories that changed everything, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. Now, to understand why Margaret's pregnancy was so monumentally significant, we need to go back to the beginning. Margaret wasn't born into just any noble family. She carried the blood of kings in her veins, specifically the bloodline of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. In medieval England, bloodlines were everything. They determined who lived, who died, and who ruled. But royal blood could be both a blessing and a death sentence. Margaret entered the world around 1443, born to John Beaufort, the first Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp. Her father was a war hero, a man who had commanded English forces in France during the final stages of the 100 Years' War. But when Margaret was barely a year old, tragedy struck. Her father died under mysterious circumstances. Some whispered suicide, others suspected poison. In those days, suspicious deaths followed powerful men like shadows. The timing couldn't have been worse. England was sliding toward chaos. The weak king Henry VI was losing his grip on power, and rival noble families were sharpening their swords for what would become the Wars of the Roses. Margaret's mother understood the rules of this dangerous game. A young girl with royal blood needed protection, and protection came through marriage alliances. By age 6, little Margaret was already betrothed to John de la Pole, connecting her family to one of England's most powerful dynasties. But politics moved faster than childhood promises. When the Duke of Suffolk fell from grace and was brutally murdered while crossing the English Channel, that betrothal became worthless. Margaret learned her first harsh lesson about survival. Adaptability meant life. Stubbornness meant death. Her next betrothal came swiftly to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. The Tudors were Welsh upstarts with questionable legitimacy, but they had something more valuable than ancient bloodlines. They had the king's favour. Edmund was Henry VI's half-brother, elevated to nobility through royal recognition rather than birthright. In 1455, when Margaret was approximately 12 years old, she married Edmund Tudor in a ceremony that sealed political alliances with words of love she barely understood. The wedding took place with all the pageantry expected of noble unions. But behind the celebration lay a darker reality. Margaret was still a child, her body not yet ready for what marriage demanded. The wedding night was traumatic in ways that Margaret never spoke of in later life. There was no concept of waiting for physical maturity in an age when noble girls existed primarily to produce heirs. Within months, Margaret's body began changing in ways that terrified her young mind. The signs of pregnancy appeared quickly, and with them came a growing sense of dread among the women who attended her. Margaret's own mother watched her daughter's condition with deep anxiety. She had been 18 when Margaret was born, old enough to survive childbirth safely. At barely 13, Margaret was attempting something that had killed countless women older and stronger than herself. But Edmund Tudor would never see his child born. In autumn 1456, while campaigning in Wales against Yorkist forces, he was captured at Carmarthen Castle. The circumstances remain murky, wrapped in the fog of civil war and political intrigue. Whether he died of plague in his prison cell or was murdered by his captors remains one of history's unsolved mysteries. What we know is that by November 1456, 13-year-old Margaret was a widow, pregnant, and utterly alone in a world exploding into violence. The news reached Margaret at Lampthe Palace, where she had been staying while her husband campaigned. The messenger arrived on a rain-soaked evening, his horse lathered with sweat from the desperate ride across Wales. Margaret was in the palace chapel when she heard the footsteps approaching. She knew before the man spoke that her world had shattered completely. Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, stepped forward to protect his pregnant sister-in-law. The decision was both chivalrous and calculating. Margaret carried the potential heir to the Tudor line, the child who might continue their family's royal connection. He brought her to his stronghold at Pembroke Castle in Wales, where massive stone walls offered protection from the growing chaos outside. The journey to Pembroke in her advanced pregnancy was an ordeal that nearly broke her. Winter roads were barely passable, rutted with frozen mud and blocked by fallen trees. Margaret travelled in a horse-drawn litter, each jolt sending pain through her swollen body. The trip that should have taken 2 days stretched to 5 as they navigated around flooded rivers and avoided bands of armed men whose loyalties were unknown. Pembroke Castle in winter was a harsh refuge. Built on limestone cliffs above the Pembroke River, the fortress dominated the landscape for miles. Its great round keep, nearly 80 feet high, had withstood sieges and storms for 3 centuries, but comfort wasn't its purpose. Survival was. The castle chambers were cold and draughty, warmed only by great fireplaces that devoured wood faster than servants could supply it. Margaret's rooms were hung with thick tapestries to block the wind that whistled through every crack in the ancient stones. The winter of 1456 to 1457 was particularly brutal. Ice formed on the inside of windows, and sea winds howled through the fortress like banshees. Margaret, her belly swollen with child, could barely walk the length of her chamber without exhausting herself. The castle physician examined her with growing alarm. Dr. Lewis Caerleon was a learned man who had studied at Oxford and Paris, attended lectures by the greatest medical minds of his generation. But as he examined the pregnant child in his care, all his learning seemed inadequate. Margaret's pelvis hadn't fully developed. The baby was positioned badly. Birth would be dangerous, perhaps fatal for both mother and child. He confided his fears to Jasper Tudor during a private meeting in the castle solar. Snow swirled outside the narrow windows as the 2 men discussed Margaret's fate in hushed tones. Caerleon was brutally honest. He had witnessed this situation countless times before, and it rarely ended well for mother or child. They could attempt to turn the baby manually, but that risked killing both patients immediately. They could wait and hope nature corrected the position, but delay increased the chances of the child's death and Margaret's complete exhaustion. Or they could attempt a cesarean birth, a procedure that was almost invariably fatal to the mother in those days. Jasper Tudor, barely 25 himself, faced a terrible burden. If Margaret died, the Tudor line would effectively end with him, a younger son with no legitimate heirs. If she lived but lost the child, the same devastating result would follow. The political implications weighed heavily, but so did personal affection. He had grown genuinely fond of the brave, intelligent girl who had faced widowhood with such remarkable dignity. As Margaret's pregnancy progressed through the dark winter months, she displayed a maturity that defied her years. She spent her time absorbing everything she could about politics and statecraft, understanding instinctively that knowledge would become her greatest weapon in the struggles ahead. intelligence and fierce determination, became her unofficial tutor in Jasper Tudor. Impressed by her sharp, the deadly arts of noble survival, he taught her to read the subtle expressions that cross people's faces, to hear the unspoken threats behind diplomatic language, to understand the intricate web of alliances and blood feuds that govern noble society. Margaret proved an exceptional student, her mind razor-sharp despite her physical suffering. She memorized genealogies, studied the shifting loyalties of major families, and learned to anticipate political moves 3 steps ahead. Margaret also threw herself into religious study with an intensity that worried those around her. She spent hours kneeling in the castle chapel until her knees bled, praying before the altar with desperate fervor. She memorized complex Latin prayers, devoured theological texts, and developed the profound personal relationship with God that would sustain her through decades of political warfare. Some historians suggest her extreme religiosity began as a coping mechanism for the trauma of child marriage and impending motherhood, a way to find meaning in suffering that otherwise seemed senseless. The castle priest, Father Meredith, became another crucial figure in Margaret's education. A Welshman educated at Cambridge before taking holy orders, he understood both classical learning and the brutal realities of political survival. He taught Margaret that God often worked through human determination, that prayer without action remained empty, but action guided by prayer could literally move mountains. These lessons would prove prophetic in the years to come. On that fateful January night in 1457, Margaret's labour began with contractions that nearly brought her to her knees. She had been walking the castle battlements, taking the exercise that Dr. Caerleon insisted was necessary for her health, despite the bitter cold. When the first wave of pain struck, it was unlike anything she had ever experienced. A crushing, tearing sensation that seemed to split her young body in half. She collapsed against the stone ramparts, gasping for breath while her attending ladies rushed to help her back to her chambers. The midwives, experienced women who had delivered countless babies throughout Wales, exchanged meaningful glances, heavy with dread. They had seen this scenario before. A child trying to give birth to a child, nature pushed beyond all reasonable limits by human ambition and political necessity. Dame Gwen ap Dafydd, the head midwife, was a woman who had been delivering babies for 30 years. She had learned her craft from her mother and grandmother, inheriting secrets passed down through generations of Welsh women. She knew which herbs could ease pain, techniques for turning breech babies, and prayers that seemed to give supernatural strength to labouring mothers. But as she examined Margaret that night, her weathered face grew increasingly grave. The other midwives prepared their instruments with grim efficiency. There were knives for cutting birth cords, but also for procedures too horrible to contemplate. There were hooks and forceps for extracting dead children, potions to strengthen failing mothers, and holy relics to invoke divine intervention when medicine reached its limits. The chamber filled with smoke from burning herbs, lavender for calming, rosemary for strength, and other plants whose properties were known only to the women who tended births and deaths. For 18 agonizing hours, Margaret labored in pain that defied all description. Her screams echoed off the stone walls until her voice gave out entirely, leaving only gasping animal sounds of pure suffering. The midwives worked frantically, their hands slick with blood as they tried desperately to save both mother and child. Dame Gwen employed every technique in her considerable arsenal. Massage, positioning changes, herbal remedies, and constant encouragement whispered in Margaret's ear. Jasper Tudor paced the corridors outside like a caged wolf, his boots clicking against the stone floors in endless rhythm. He knew that the entire future of the Lancastrian cause might die in that chamber. Through the heavy oak door, he could hear Margaret's screams, each one cutting through him like a physical blade. Servants hurried past with basins of steaming water and armloads of clean linen, their faces reflecting the gravity of the unfolding crisis. Father Meredith knelt in the chapel throughout the night, praying without ceasing for the young woman whose life hung by the thinnest possible thread. As dawn approached grey and cold, Margaret's strength began to fail catastrophically. She had been in active labour for nearly 24 hours, her young body pushed far beyond any reasonable limit. Dr. Caerleon, summoned from his uneasy sleep, examined her with growing desperation and spoke in urgent whispers with Dame Gwen. The baby was still alive but showing signs of severe distress, its heartbeat irregular and increasingly weak. Margaret was bleeding internally, her pulse thready and weak, her skin pale as parchment. The moment of ultimate decision had arrived. They would attempt manual extraction, a dangerous procedure that might save the child but would almost certainly cost the mother her life. When the baby finally emerged, torn from Margaret's shattered body in a process that nearly killed her, the midwives held their collective breath in the sudden, terrible silence. The infant was pale and barely breathing, covered in blood and birthing fluid. For one terrifying moment, the only sounds in the chamber were Margaret's laboured breathing and the crackling of flames in the hearth. Then Dame Gwen cleared the baby's mouth and throat with practiced efficiency, and the sound that changed the course of English history filled the air. A thin, angry wail announced the arrival of Henry Tudor, the future king who would end the Wars of the Roses and establish a dynasty that would rule England for over a century. Margaret, barely conscious and her body permanently damaged by the horrific ordeal, heard her son's first cry through a haze of pain and utter exhaustion. She tried desperately to reach for him, but her arms refused to obey her mind's commands. Dame Gwen placed the baby on Margaret's chest for one precious moment, the traditional first meeting between mother and child, before rushing him to the fire to be cleaned and properly swaddled. The damage to Margaret's body was severe and permanent. At 13, she would never bear another child. Her reproductive life had been sacrificed on the altar of dynastic politics, her childhood stolen by forces far beyond her control. But if Margaret Beaufort's body was broken, her spirit remained unshattered. What happened next defies belief. This traumatized girl would spend the next 3 decades orchestrating one of the most brilliant political campaigns in English history. Through 3 more marriages, years of exile, and constant danger, she never lost sight of her ultimate goal: putting her son on the throne of England. When Henry Tudor finally invaded England in 1485, it was Margaret's intelligence network, Margaret's political alliances, and Margaret's strategic genius that made his victory possible. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, as Richard III died in the mud, Margaret watched her son become Henry VII, King of England. The boy, whose violent birth nearly killed them both, had become the founder of the Tudor dynasty. Margaret Beaufort lived to see her granddaughter-in-law, Anne Boleyn, give birth to Elizabeth I. The genetic line that began in agony at Pembroke Castle would produce some of England's greatest monarchs. Sometimes the most extraordinary destinies begin with the most ordinary human suffering. That 13-year-old girl screaming in a Welsh castle chamber couldn't have imagined she was giving birth to the future of England itself. But perhaps that's how history really works, not through grand gestures or noble speeches, but through the quiet courage of people who refuse to surrender, even when surrender seems like mercy.